Liver fat is a problem, okay? It can lead to a lot of potential problems. High levels of liver fat can lead to diabetes, it can lead to kidney issues, hypertension, you name it. And when we look at sort of the hierarchy of what's the most dangerous fat that we store in our body to the least dangerous, it usually goes in this order. Visceral fat is the most dangerous, then liver fat is probably a close second, okay, then subcutaneous fat, which is just sort of the unsightly white fat that we have, and then the best kind of fat is brown fat. That's going to be sort of thermically active, can actually help you burn more fat. Point is, liver fat is not good. And when you start looking at various dietary protocols, it's so easy to say, this is perfect. Keto is perfect for this. Or no, high fiber is perfect for it. We have to look at all the data because right now there's conflicting stuff out there. We have one camp that says fats, monounsaturated fatty acids, are driving down fatty liver disease. And on the other side, we say fiber is driving down fatty liver disease. But when you start looking at the data, it's pretty intriguing. And there's a study that was published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism that looked at just this. This took a look at 43 individuals with a high monounsaturated fatty acid diet compared to a high fiber diet compared to a control diet. Okay, they looked at glucose tolerance, they looked at hepatic fat, so liver fat, and they also looked at their body composition. Okay, now this was a 12-week study and it was isocaloric, so that means they ate the same exact amount of calories between each group. The liver fat in the monounsaturated fatty acid group, the group that had high amounts of avocado oil, olive oil, macadamia nuts, things like that, was 18% lower than when they started. Whereas the high fiber group in the control group didn't have much change at all, nothing that was really worth noting. 12 weeks isn't really a whole lot of time to determine microbiome changes, but that's not the deal here. I'm not a microbiome expert. What's interesting is that the monounsaturated fatty acid group naturally ended up eating about 15 grams less carbohydrates per meal. Now, given they might be eating 3, 4, 5 times per day, that could range anywhere from 30 to 60 less grams of carbs per day. We do at least kind of know from other bodies of research that excess carbohydrates are a risk factor for fatty liver disease. If these subjects were eating a fair amount of carbohydrates more than they were burning, then certainly you could imply that those excess carbohydrates could lead to more liver fat, or at least the inhibition of lipolysis of that hepatic fat. So this is concerning because then it makes us think, okay, well, shoot, I just need to cut carbs out all the way. No, it's still an energy balance equation to a certain degree. And we also have to remember that saturated fat plays a role here too, which was not really looked at these studies. So then there was another study that was published in Diabetes Care that looked at something similar. This one looked at 45 type 2 diabetics divided into 4 groups for 8 weeks. First group was a high carb and high fiber diet. Second group was a high carb, high fiber plus exercise group. The next group was a high monounsaturated fatty acid diet, and the fourth group was high monounsaturated fatty acid plus exercise. The monounsaturated fat only group without exercise ended up having a 29% reduction in liver fat. The monounsaturated fatty acid group with exercise had a 25% reduction. That is negligible, so I don't want you to take that to the bank and say, I never have to do exercise again. What's important here is that the fiber groups, high carb, high fiber, was only a 6% reduction and a 4% reduction in liver fat. So the monounsaturated fat group led to much less overall liver fat. However, guess what? They ate significantly less carbohydrates. So to the undertone of this video, you're probably thinking Thomas is going at an anti-carb angle here. And to a certain degree, I am. I am anti-excess carbs. I think that's a serious problem. I really do. But we need isocaloric and macros that are matched, okay? So with that, here is an interesting study that looked at sort of the Mediterranean approach. This was published in BMJ and it took a look at 49 individuals with type 2 diabetes. Okay, it divided them into groups. One group was a high monounsaturated fatty acid group and one group was a multifactorial group with high monounsaturated fats, high fiber, high polyphenols, high vitamin D, and relatively high antioxidant levels. That sounds a lot like the Mediterranean approach, right? High fiber and lots of olive oil, avocados, maybe things like that. Maybe avocados aren't technically Mediterranean, but they fit the nutrient profile of Mediterranean. With this study, what's important is calories were matched and macros were matched. Equal amounts of protein, fats, and carbs between the groups, okay? Just different types of food. Now we're getting somewhere. The weight stayed the same between both groups, as it should. Isocaloric, the weight should stay the same. They shouldn't lose more amounts of weight that's statistically significant when they're eating the same amount of calories. What was interesting, hepatic fat, liver fat, went down 40% in the multifactorial group, the group that ate fats, ate the carbs, ate the fiber, 40% versus the monounsaturated fat only group, 19%, which is just in line with the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism study we talked about in the very beginning. Pretty interesting, right? So monounsaturated fatty acids, sure, those are awesome, but monounsaturated fatty acids plus fiber seems to be even better. So it's all about that combination of eating that sort of Mediterranean style diet with your own personal flair on it. I personally like to go Mediterranean with even more fiber and obviously less of the refined starches and things that might end up in there naturally. I think the microbiome diversity plays a significant role here because over time we need to be paying attention to that. I have an interesting analogy that I want to break down that kind of shows you through illustration how you can kind of stop liver fat burning when excess carbohydrates are in the equation. Okay, so let's talk about that in just a second. But as far as microbiome goes, I do recommend a good probiotic, and I put a link down below for seed. So when we're talking about gut diversity, we're talking about fiber content, it's all about those short chain fatty acids, which we'll get to in just a second. So people ask the one that I recommend, that is a link down below for 15% off of seed, which is a synbiotic, a prebiotic and a probiotic together. Okay, very cool research that they're doing specifically on the gut-brain axis and things like that. If you are going to take one supplement, I definitely think that it's going to be between magnesium and it's going to be probiotics, in between those two. I don't think there's a lot of need to add a lot of other vitamins and supplements into your mix. Okay, so that link down below is for seed. Again, you're going to save 15% off, but you have to use that code that's down below. So definitely recommend you add it into your life if you're trying to work on that gut microbiome a bit. I want you to envision this for a second. Okay, you have a train and you have a room that has a bunch of coal. You have the coal room. That coal is fat, okay? And you have to shovel that coal into the engine to keep the engine going. It's an old school like steam train, right? Okay, that's great. You are burning fat. Great, terrific. You're even burning some liver fat. Terrific. The faster the train goes, the more fat you're burning, okay? But then you get to a certain point where someone throws in a bunch of wood chips. Wood chips are gonna burn faster than the coal. They're gonna incinerate really quick, right? And the smaller the wood chip, the higher glycemic, the faster they burn. Those wood chips are carbs. If you throw the carbs in, they're going to get burned. And the coal is gonna take a back seat for a second because the wood chips burn faster. Because guess what? Carbs generally do burn faster. They are prioritized. So if you are burning fat and you're going through that mode and all of a sudden you throw some carbohydrates in, the carbohydrates are going to burn. Does that mean that it's ruining all fat loss for you? No, it does not. But it does mean that the carbs are prioritized and that the door to the coal room temporarily gets closed. Now, this ultimately does stand in the way of fat loss for a little bit, but it's not the end of the world. You're just going to prioritize the burning of those carbs first. But it illustrates exactly what can happen here. Then you pull the carbs back for a little bit, and yes, you have an opportunity to dip into those hepatic triglycerides a little bit more and burn those as fat. This is illustrated quite well in a diabetes care meta-analysis that looked at 24 different studies with over 1,400 people. They looked at a high monounsaturated fatty acid diet that had lower levels of carbohydrates compared to a higher carbohydrate diet with a little bit less in the way of monounsaturated fatty acids. They found that there was a small yet statistically significant decrease in body fat in the group that had the overall monounsaturated fatty acids compared to the high carb protocol. This is simple though. In this particular case, you are probably conditioning the body to utilize those fats a little bit better. It does not mean that everyone's going to operate the same way. Okay, if you're looking specifically at insulin-resistant people, people that are pre-diabetic, people that are type 2 diabetic, remember that they are metabolically damaged. And unfortunately, a lot of people, over 50% of our population, are at least pre-diabetic. So we can sort of elucidate that a lot of people are going to have this metabolic issue here. So it's not to say that carbohydrates are bad, but when people are in this metabolic dysfunction, as they likely are, restricting carbohydrates and increasing these fats might allow for this hepatic triglyceride to release a little bit more. So you're able to tap into that liver fat more. Now, that's sort of the mechanism of how monounsaturated fats encourage liver fat utilization. It's not that they're necessarily magical, it's that they're probably restricting carbohydrate intake. But monounsaturated fats through what's called OEA, oleoethylamine, they do have some abilities to help us oxidize fat more. But where does fiber come in? How does fiber help with overall liver fat reduction? Well, for one, delaying gastric emptying. And it all comes back to that metabolic dysfunction once again, right? There was a study published in Functional Foods, looked at 22 different studies, another meta-analysis, that demonstrated that just 10 grams of fiber dosed per day for 8 weeks led to less insulin resistance and more whole body insulin sensitivity. This really tells us, paints a very valid picture of when you're looking at people that are insulin resistant, increasing fiber to delay the spike in carbohydrates to a rate at which the cells can handle it really makes a big difference. That allows that insulin sensitivity to come back in people that are insulin resistant. If you're not insulin resistant, it might be a little more negligible, might not be as big of a deal. But again, the chances of you being insulin resistant are quite high, unfortunately, and that's just statistics and the way that it is. Now then there's a little bit more mechanistic-y stuff that happens here. Okay, so we have the fermentation of fiber, which is gonna lead to what's called butyrate. And butyrate in and of itself is a signaling device. Okay, it helps with overall glucose metabolism, helps with fatty acid oxidation, and it does this through signaling. This is another reason why gut diversity and microbiome is so important to pay attention to. With that, butyrate and short chain fatty acids, independent of anything to do with digestion or even fermentation, seem to play a role as far as insulin sensitivity is concerned. It actually can help with insulin secretion. And the full mechanisms there are beyond me. They're beyond a lot of research right now. We just know that when there's more short chain fatty acids from more fiber, we tend to see better response to carbohydrates. Insulin spikes the way it should and then comes back down. And then lastly, the modulation of gut incretins. So we've got glucagon-like peptide 1, we've got peptide YY, which all play a role in our satiety. And if we're eating less, we're gonna store less liver fat. At the end of the day, one of the most important things that I can tell you is no matter what kind of diet you are doing, putting yourself into this deficit, however you get there, keto, paleo, vegan, whatever, is going to allow you to tap into that liver fat more. But it seems as though that multifactorial approach is the best. But at the end of the day, eat less, move more. I'll see you tomorrow.